Well, as Dr. Meena Kumari said, it is definitely the key in order to understand about the various qualitative and quantitative techniques being used as part of the research. There are lots that we can talk about this today. So consider the session to be quite in an initial phase, and there are multiple levels of such sessions that could be conducted for. So I'll go through some of the overview perspective on both qualitative and quantitative research. I have got my research papers in ABDC journal for both qualitative as well as the quantitative research methods. So the agenda for today is, as I said, it's in two parts. The first would be an introduction to research, primarily focusing on the quantitative perspective, and the next would be on qualitative research. So within the quantitative, there are a lot of theories that we could talk about here. We'll start with something very basic of what is the difference between applied and the basic business research. Going through some of the concepts of what the modeling is, what concept is, how do we then make use of the theories. So some of those would be discussed on. I have the next portion related with the data analysis and overview. I can also walk you through with the live data, which was collated from different respondents. Now, this is something wherein I start with, as part of quantitative research, you would be collecting survey. And once you collect the survey, how should you go about by making use of some of the concepts like data cleaning, data consistency check, porting the data into SPSS, what kind of checks would you be doing in, right from the reliability and validity, and then getting into some regression or structural equation modeling. So if the participants are interested, then I can walk you through a demonstration of this as well. If you can confirm that if you're interested, please.
Yes, sir.
The participants, yeah?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
So I can walk you through this journey as well about typically as a researcher or as a scholar, what you would like to do is, once you collect the data from, say, Google Forms after the questionnaire is designed and all, how should you go about it? I could do that. Then I'll walk you through some of the research process, the measurement, scaling, and what is the measurement as well as the scaling concepts, and then the sampling. Okay. Then a brief on an introduction to qualitative research. Now, there are a lot of these things. I will see how we can work through with the kind of 2 hours that I have to complete the session today. Okay. In the meantime, what I would request you all is, if there are some concepts which are already covered as part of this FDP, for example, some of the speakers who came in yesterday or today morning, if any of the concepts are already covered, then please do let me know so that I don't repeat them. And I can focus more on from the data analysis and some of those key areas which are not yet covered, so that it's beneficial from scheduling point of view. Okay. So going through what is the research all about. It is a systematic and objective for identification, collection, analysis, dissemination, and use of information. Very simplistic to put it. Okay. Why we call it systematic? If you look into the various keywords here, why is it systematic? The approach needs to happen by which a scholar has to define the approach to be used in for performing the research, right from the point of view of how would you define what kind of problem does it exist? How do you identify the problem? What are the objectives of the research? Followed by how would you identify the extant research that exists for? What kind of analysis has been done by them? How would you go about by designing your own research? How would you collect the data? What methodology would be using for it? When you do the analysis, how would you do? Would you be doing in like a regression? Why should you be doing regression? If you go in for structural equation modeling, what is the need for it and why would you do it? What kind of sample size are required in order to do these collection based upon the type of methods that we choose and for? So, and then drawing inference out of it, and then eventually disseminating the information. Okay, now dissemination of the information can again comes in various fronts. For example, based upon your research that you have done, it could lead to some policy changes that could be implemented within the organization or within the government per se. So the kind of impact it brings into the community as well as into the social perspective needs to be looked in for the research when it is being performed. So it is a very systematic approach of what we do. If you do it as part of your research, PhD, or even if you're engaging in any of the research perspective. Does somebody have a question? Am I audible? Can you all hear me?
Yes,
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
I think we are getting some noise then. Dr. Meera, can I request you to please mute everyone? Okay, thanks.
I'm doing it, yeah.
Okay, thanks. Okay, now, so having known about the objective and the purpose of why we need to engage into research, though I have mentioned this as market research, this could be something looked in from the generic point of view of getting engaged into research. So it could also be used for the purpose of improving the decision making related to, if you look primarily from the marketing point of view, to understand what the problems are, what could be the solution to the problems, as well as the opportunity that exists for, and which could lead to a reduced cost of wrong decisions. Typically, when we look in from the industrial perspective, as executives, as managers, we take a lot of decisions. We need to evaluate the current existing scenario in order to make decisions, and it has to be the conscious decisions that managers need to make. And for without substantive information and supportive of the data, it could lead to various incorrect decisions costing organizations millions of dollars. So that is something very, very critical. Reducing the time to market when getting there ahead of competition, the very basis of what we look into. I think somebody by the name Priya, you need to go on mute. Priya Shukla, can you go on mute, please? Okay. Meena ma'am, I need your help if you can mute Priya Shukla.
Yeah, so the moment I mute them, it goes again back to unmute.
Okay.
1 minute. I'll do it.
Okay, thanks. Okay, and the key for every organization again is to, the basic is to make profits by which they can then survive within the market, within the competition, and they look for the growth. Growth can be in terms of market share, sustained growth as well. Okay, and find the different methods in order to retain the customers. In such a competitive world with globalization, organizations need to ensure that it's not, can you all hear me? I hope I'm not muted.
I have not muted you, but again.
No, I got a message that the host is muted. I hope I'm audible now.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Perfect.
Yeah, you are audible, sir. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, thanks. So conducting a research is to deal with any problem that is scientific, systematic, and interlinked exercise. Now, what we talk about this interlinking is all about, if I identify a problem statement, identify the objective, identify the methodology to be do, how should we collect the data, how should we do the analysis, all these to be interlinked. It can't be done in isolation. So it has to be a specific systematic approach in order to perform these activities. Okay. Having said that, using the research, it provides specific information which is necessary in order to address these issues. Managers, it manages and implements the data collection process, analyze the result, communicate the findings and their implication to both the executives, if it is part of the organization, as well as within the academic community. It helps managers to make use of the information in order to make appropriate decisions, right decisions, timely decisions. Both are again key from the industry point of view. Okay. Now going into some of the basics of what is the approach or the different methods being used as part of the research criteria, I will start with something what is known as an applied research and the basic business research. The applied research is something what is conducted in order to address a specific business decision for a firm or organization, which directly addresses the problem at hand. Some examples are like, should McDonald's add an Italian pasta as part of the dinners to its menu? Which sort of health insurance plan should the business provide for its employees? So these are the specific problems which the organization or a firm faces. And that is what is being used, which is an application of the knowledge or application of in the business environment of what we talk it as the applied business research. The second is the basic. Okay, basic is also something what is known as a pure research, which is conducted without a specific decision in mind and usually does not address the needs of a specific organization. For example, I've given a couple of examples at the end. Any idea how do I remove or minimize this control that I see on the top? It is actually eating up on my either at the title or at the end. It actually occupies the space. Is there any way by which I can minimize it? Any idea? Okay, I hope it worked. Yeah, okay. Some examples are, do consumers experience cognitive dissonance? I hope you all understand what cognitive dissonance is. It is a kind of unsurety which comes into the minds of the consumer when they buy a purchase. For example, say I have bought a mobile phone. Now I have done my own analysis in order to understand which one is better, which one should I go for, what should be the value associated with it. And eventually after making a purchase, I show it across to my peers or to my family members or to my friends, could be anyone. Okay, then somebody suddenly comes up and says, oh, you could have bought it from another place that could have been of better quality or of a cheaper price. So again, it becomes a kind of, dissonance in the mind of the consumers by which they're looking for, did I take the right decision? Should I would have explored. They could also lead to some sort of the kind of experience the consumers has faced in this whole process, and also with respect to the satisfaction as well as the dissatisfaction level with respect to the usage of it, and whether the decisions that has been taken has been appropriate. The other is, does employee turnover with a company influence the productivity? And this is very, very key for all the organizations in order to understand the productivity associated with not only just the whole business, also looking at every individual or every employee who works in for to understand about the productivity level. So this could be something which could be used as a pure research or a basic business research. During the process of what we have gone through in the past couple of days, the research process should have been discussed for. I understand you had a session in the morning as well, wherein you looked into how do you define a research problem. So I won't be repeating some of this, but for ensuring that we all bring everyone into the same page, I'm quickly defining the research process. So it follows into key 6 steps. First step is to define the problem. Second step is to develop an approach to the problem. Third is to formulate a research design. Fourth is doing the field work or collecting the data. The fifth is to prepare and analyze the data. And the sixth step is to prepare and present the report. Now, as I said, step number 1 and step number 2, you would have already gone through in the morning session by Dr. Ramesh today. So I won't be repeating some of those. But there are some key areas that we'll be looking into, for example, formulating the research design or doing the field work, collecting the data. This could also depend upon the type of research activity that you would be engaged in, qualitative or a quantitative research, whether you do in for, go to conduct the interview live from the field, or is it something that you use a survey method in order to collect the data? Do you use some sort of mechanical device in order to observe the consumer behavioral perspective, collect those data, and then do the analysis for? Step number 5 deals with, when we talk about preparing and analyzing, there are certain prerequisites to be met while after doing the collection of the data. What sort of, checks, data consistency checks, data cleaning perspective needs to be looked into. Or if it is a qualitative data, how do we make use of, transcribing the data, defining the content codes? How do we make use of, in order to make sure that we are in a position to analyze some of those data? And eventually, step number 6 is to present it across by preparing a particular report. So this is very high level to go through a 6-step process as part of the research. The next I will go through with the data analysis overview, and I will also go through a demonstration with this data analysis, and anything that I have already covered as part of this demonstration. I will not be repeating anything which is required as part of some of the slides. I will cover those portions as well. So the very first question which comes in is, what is variable? A variable is defined as an image, a perception, or a concept that is measurable. Okay. Now the key word here is that it should be measurable. So there are key differentiating factors between what we call as a concept or as a perception compared to what a variable is. The key is here is about what is measurable. For example, gender. So how do we define a gender? We could based upon male or female. Variable can take on different values, which are often expressed as numbers. For example, if we talk about age in X number of years or Y number of months. And we use of the measurement scales, which could vary the degree of precision in the measurement. I'll explain about more of this when we come into the measurement perspective. So what is the key difference between the concept and variable? Concepts are something which cannot be measured. For example, if I talk about satisfaction, my perspective of satisfaction might be totally different than, for example, of Dr. Meena Kumari, for example, if we have 100 participants in this session today, each one of them might have a different perception of how do they perceive about satisfaction. Are they really satisfied? Are they very highly satisfied, or they are not satisfied? So satisfaction by itself is a concept which brings in various different meanings to the different people. Variables are something, as I said in the last slide, which can be measured. For example, I can identify the weight of a person and quantify it. Say there are some standards associated with, for example, the weight measured in kilogram or grams. We normally use the concept in order to convert the concepts into variable using a set of indicators in order to subjectively measure. For example, if we talk about the social sciences predominantly into the management and all, we cannot get into the head of a consumer in order to understand their cognitive level or their behavioral pattern or what he or she is thinking about it. So it becomes highly critical for us to have certain set of indicators in order to measure them. For example, if we talk about effectiveness, attitude, satisfaction, each one of them is quite variant. And it is critical in order to convert these concepts into variables using set of indicators. The set of indicators could be, for example, I could say satisfaction on a measurement scale of a Likert scale of 1 to 5, 1 to 7, 1 to 10. Or it could be something with zeros and ones. Okay, satisfied, not satisfied. So I could define some sort of measurements associated with this. How do we convert these concepts into variables? And what indicators can be identified as? For example, if you look into the concept of rich or poor, the different indicators could be based upon the income, based upon the value of the assets. Okay, and the variables could be, in case of income, what is the total income the person earns, or it could be for a family, for example. Similarly, if we talk about the assets, what is the total value of the assets which are being possessed by an individual, say the home, the car, as well as the investments being made. So why is it critical is because in every research that we get involved in, we look first for the concepts and identify how do I measure each of the concepts by making use of variables. Simply defining a dependent, independent variables, mediators, moderators is not sufficient, but we need to look into the concepts and the method to measure each one of them by making use of the variables. So then we arrive at a working definition. For the different, what we looked into the concept, indicators, and variables, the working definition for rich person would be, I can define this, and this is based upon the type of markets we are in or our study. For example, if I'm doing in India, I can say the person would be rich if the income of the individual is greater than 2 lakhs per month. Is it applicable in other domains? It may not be. For example, in the US, it's quite different. So I can define based upon the context of my study what should be the working definition of what rich is. And second, with the value of assets, whether a person could be considered rich or not. So an example is considered rich if the total value of the asset is greater than, say, 2 crores of rupees. Then once we have come into some methods in order to understand about what the concepts to be used as part of my study and what indicators, variables, and some working definition, we normally get into the concept of defining the models and making use of them as part of the quantitative study. Okay, I'll go through with a very simple examples, then I will get into a demonstration mode for this. For example, I want to measure the buying intention, which is a dependent variable, and brand image is an independent variable. Okay? I hope you all understand about dependent, independent variables. There are a lot of concepts that we talk when it comes into the analysis part. When we talk about the, so it's very simplistic form of dependent, independent, followed by the other structure that we use in for the mediation, moderation, and all. So I'll go into a very simplistic form as part of this, whereas the mediation and moderation analysis are predominantly what I would cover in the advanced level of these workshops. So for making it very simplistic one, say I have a dependent and an independent variable, I define the relationship between them by making use of a hypothesis. Hypothesis would be the brand image has a significant impact on buying intention. Now, when we define hypothesis, this could be, I hope you all understand about null hypothesis, alternate hypothesis, and directional hypothesis. So here I have simply stated that it has got a significant impact on the buying intention. I can also define an equation associated with it by using, say, a regression equation with the buying intention as equal to a B0 plus B1 into the brand image. If I have further expansion related with my theoretical model, so I've got another dimension or another factor associated with it, which is a perceived awareness, and its hypothesis would be perceived awareness has a significant impact on buying intention. With if I have 2 different independent variables and 1 dependent variable, the equation would be B0 plus B1, brand image plus B2 into the perceived awareness. Very simplistic. Like this, I can expand onto it by bringing up my whole theoretical model in place in order to understand what variables should I measure and how should I measure them. Okay, and if we have 5 different variables, I can bring it into an equation with a multiple regression for this particular model. But typically, this is just an example what I took into. Typically, when we proceed on further with this kind of conceptual model, we will get into what is known as a structural equation modeling in order to understand about the interlinkage or the interlinkage of the relationship between each of the independent and dependent variables. And that is why it comes in, because SEM eventually uses regression, but there are certain advantages associated with making use of regression structural equation modeling putting together in some kind of model. For example, if you make use of SPSS, MOS, or if you use the Smart PLS or EDENCO or RStudio in order to evaluate these models, and why should I use SEM or PLS versus using regression. So as a research scholar, we need to be very, very sure about what is the approach we're going to use for making the statistical analysis and the measurements. Okay, so these are the different hypotheses which could be defined associated with this model. Now, moving on further, typically what we look for when we define the different concepts to be used as part of our study is we use certain theoretical base, we use certain existing theories on which we would develop in further. So this could be based upon the extant literature or the literature review that we eventually going for. We're doing an exhaustive review in order to understand, based upon the context that I'm currently working on, what type of literature exists, how should I make use of these variables within my context, and what is relevant and what may not be relevant. For example, this is a model which is a UT-AUT2, which has been conceptualized by Venkatesh in the year 2016. It is known as a extended UT-AUT because it is an extension of UT-AUT, which was conceptualized by Venkatesh in 2003. And prior to that, UT-AUT by itself is a combination of 8 different models, including TAM and diffusion of innovation. TAM is something very popular, which was introduced in 1989, almost more than 3 decades ago by Davis. So there are these kind of, contributions being made by researchers worldwide, and we make use of these models as part of our study in order to extend them in the context of the framework of what we use them for. So for example, if I want to make use of this as part of my study, what are the different extensions that I could look in for? We would typically go in for 4 different type of extensions. So what we have, if I want to briefly explain about this model, is there are 7 different variables, which leads to explaining the behavior and intent, which in turn leads to the use behavior. So if you want to understand about the behavioral intent of an individual, it could be the performance expectancy, effort. These are nothing but how easy is it to make use of those technology that exist. For example, mobile payments, mobile banking, or any such usage that we could use it for. Okay, the kind of social influence, facilitating condition, the hedonic motivation, price value, and the habit. Okay, these are 7 different variables which then leads to the behavioral intent. And there are 3 different moderators. Now, this is the model that has been conceptualized and validated by Venkatesh in 2016. Now, if I want to use in my context of the study, the kind of extensions that I could go in for is define new exogenous mechanism. For example, which variables would derive performance expectancy or hedonic motivation or price value or habit? I could define that. So the exogenous mechanism is nothing but which refers to the external predictors of these 7 exogenous variables as part of the UTI. So this is one way of extending the model. The second way of extending the model is by defining a new endogenous mechanism. That means along with this, what I have 7, I add one more, which is the 8th one. Okay. That would be an endogenous mechanism, which in turn will derive the behavior of the dependent variable, which is a behavioral intent or the use behavior, for example. So an example could be, for example, if based upon the context of the study, say I want to identify about the usage behavior and behavioral intent of why consumers use mobile payments or mobile banking or digital payments, for example, or doing an electronic commerce. So in each of the scenarios, if I want to make use of to understand about the transactions which involves financial transactions, it is very, very critical that the consumer trusts the service provider. So trust becomes an important component which should be added onto the existing model, which does not exist for, that becomes an endogenous mechanism. Similarly, I could also add a new moderating mechanism. Okay, now to give you in a very simplistic form, what is a moderator is, whenever you define hypotheses and you test them as part of your model, you want to, it will give you the results about whether it is applicable, significant, not significant, whether it is something which becomes the sample that you have taken for, whether it is applicable for the complete size of the sample that you have taken, or does it exhibit separate characteristics for example, if I talk about the gender, whether the sample that I've collected for exhibits different characteristics for male and different characteristics for female, because the way that we approach for the various things, it's different for male as well as female. So looking into, rather than generalizing them across the board, I can create specific characteristics to define those. Those are the moderating mechanisms. What has been defined as part of the study, the UTA-UT2 work, gender, age, and experience. Now I can have additional moderating mechanism. For example, if I'm looking in for some of the usage behavior of the individuals, I can say how frequently do they use them? Is it medium, high, low? Is it very frequent? So I can have a different moderating mechanism in order to understand whether the characteristics exhibited by the sample collected for, is it common across the board, or is it exhibiting different characters for the different type of habitual behavior of the individuals? Okay. Then the fourth method to extend this is by making use of a new outcome mechanism. For example, if I want to understand about the loyalty, satisfaction, whether the use behavior can lead to the satisfaction of the consumer, I can further extend this particular model with adding on additional variables which could be defined as an outcome mechanism. That means use behavior leads to satisfaction, or use behavior leads to the loyalty, and how they are interlinked with each other. So these are the key 4 areas that could be looked into for extending a model. I've taken this UTA-UT2 as an example. This is applicable for any scenario or any basis that you're looking for. It could be, looking in combining multiple models, or looking in for the exogenous, endogenous, moderation, as well as the outcome mechanisms. Okay, maybe what I'll do is I'll do a quick pause here in order to check if there are any questions from the participants. Then I will proceed further with the next step. Any questions from anybody? I hope I'm audible and everybody is still there in the call.
Yes, sir. We are in the meeting. No problem,
Okay.
sir.
Okay, perfect. Okay. This was to give you a brief introduction about how we progress on typically, because most of the quantitative studies would make use of the models, and then we look in for, what we see is novelty from the context of the study, the domain what we are using for. So I thought it will be quite relevant in order to briefly describe about this. Now, in the research process, there are a lot of things that we would look in for. This is my way of representing it. So what we could do is, typically we start with the literature review. Now, literature review, which is something iterative in process. That means, though we start our research from looking at the extant literatures in order to understand what kind of work has been done and how should I go about further. Now, there are a lot of outcomes which comes in as part of the literature review. First is to look into all these theoretical and the concepts as well as the models, what exist for. Looking into various research documents, like what kind of empirical studies has been done. If I look into the not only defining a particular area, but I can also expand some of the horizons in order to look into based on the mobile financial services, which includes mobile payments, mobile commerce, as well as mobile banking. I'm looking for various studies that exist currently. I hope you're all familiar with what a systematic literature review or meta-analysis is. This is another form of review that we normally look in for. So whenever you are starting with your research process, I would strongly recommend you to definitely look in for some of the contributions made by other researchers in the form of SLRs as well as meta-analysis. Both of these are very, very relevant and contributed towards the studies by which you can conceptualize your model. I have also done one of the studies which is currently under review in ABDC A category journal for the meta-analysis. The other outcomes as part of the literature review would also be, since you had a session today on the research problems and research objectives, That is also one of the outcomes from the literature review in order to understand what currently exists, what researchers have done for. Then you define your hypothesis based upon the literature review. Again, when you define hypothesis, always the preferred method would be to make use of directional hypothesis. The next step is identify the theoretical model, and what I defined in the previous slide, made use of UTI, UT2, and identify your own, the question which comes in, should I use the existing model as is, or should I go in for any updates? Ideally, looking from the context as well as the domain of your study. Again, if you are submitting any of your research for as part of your say ABDC journals, the first and foremost thing they would ask for is what is the base from which you have conceptualized it, and then comes in for, if you have not used the existing model as is, you need to have a rationale for it. If you're going in for any extensions, again, you need to have a rationale for it. So be very, very specific about if you're updating or modifying from the context of a study, why is it so? Okay, so identify the constructs, the different items. Okay, these are nothing but the, I hope you understand the constructs or the factors, items are nothing but the different questions that you would be using in for. What are the dependent, independent variables, mediators, and the moderators? Develop your questionnaire. Now, developing questionnaire is one of the key critical perspective on which your whole study, your whole research is dependent on. Questionnaire designing by itself is a PhD's job. So when the models are being conceptualized, it will also come up with certain questions. My recommendation would always be you should adopt a questionnaire, modify it from the context of a study. Do not try to simply add a question by itself. Otherwise, as a research scholar, you might be landing up in trouble. You might be analyzing the data, you might be doing a lot of data collection, you might not get results, because it cannot be something by which you can do an experimentation. This is something which should go with a standardized. We do not have standardized scale, unlike in other domains. Since we are working in into the management, we cannot get into the head of the consumers in order to understand about what it is, why is it, how is it, and if they behave, why do they behave in a certain way. Because we all as human beings are quite complex in nature. We might behave differently in the morning, in the afternoon, in the night. If you're given a particular task, if we had a fight or a tiff, we might behave differently. So the emotional level of the individuals comes into the play. So our pattern would be totally different. Hence, whenever we talk about the questionnaire, always make use of some theoretical model in which they would have empirically tested those scale as well. Okay, so looking from the demographic point of view, when we talk about the constructs, each construct should have at least 3 questions and identify what should be a Likert scale. If you're using 5-point or 7-point or 9-point, again, you need to have a rationale for it. And then do a validation for it. Now, it could be an expert in that particular field. Then do a pilot study in order to, look for ensuring that your questionnaire is done. If there are any issues, sort out them. It could be with a small sample size using some convenient sampling method and using a survey method. Then do a pilot study. For example, if you're using a structural equation modeling, going for the exploratory factor analysis in order to make sure that whatever that you have collected for actually complies with some of those reliability and the validity. So once you've done this pilot study, get into the final model and the final questionnaire. So that means anything that has been developed as part of a questionnaire, it can be clearly understood by the respondents, and respondents, because purely everything is based upon the respondents and how they provide response to. So a pilot study is highly, highly recommended as part of your research process. So once you have defined or designed the final questionnaire, make a sample size estimation, going for the data collection, identify the duration. Okay, typically, this is what we would go in for as part of our research. Then if you're doing a structural equation modeling, it typically comes in 2-step process. the confirmatory as well as the path analysis. You identify what is the measurement model and the structural model. So define the model fitness, construct validity, some of these concepts we will be looking into. And what type of constructs are these? Are they reflective in nature or are they formative in nature? Accordingly, we might need to choose the appropriate statistical tool. For example, SPSS, MOS, or Smart PLS. Again, you need to have a rationale of why do you choose a particular package based upon the concept that exists for. When I talk about the concepts, again, whether they are reflective in nature or they are formative or composite in nature. So accordingly, the package has to be chosen and for. The structural model, wherein you do the hypothesis testing, the goodness of fit indices, and then based upon the study, whether you have mediation or the moderation, identify the direct and indirect effects in case of the mediation and the moderation as well. Now, there are some prerequisites to be met if you want to use the moderation. Look in for those. For example, measurement invariance is something which should be checked for in order to do a pre-validation before you go in for the moderation check. Ensure that your data analysis includes all those prerequisites as well. And then into the structural equation modeling, the path analysis in order to validate. Then comes in the thesis as well as the report writing. For example, if you're part of a PhD when you want to submit your thesis, or if you're doing your research and you want to submit into a particular journal, identify the inferences. The results also needs to be looked in from the perspective of if you found a result, for example, a particular relationship to be significant or not significant, you need to do a compare and contrast with the extant literatures in order to understand whether it is similar to other studies or is it different. If it is, you need to again provide an inference out of it, stating that why did you find it to be not significant or significant as well in the context of your study. So you must have all those rationales built in throughout the study that you get engaged in. And then looking for the scope or the future direction as well as publish your paper in the peer-reviewed journal. Okay. Any questions on this process? I'll do a quick 2 minutes break if there are any questions.
No, sir.
Okay, perfect. So I've tried to put this together in a single slide throughout the journey of it. Okay, what is a research design? It is a framework or a blueprint for conducting the marketing research project, which details the procedures which are necessary for obtaining the information needed to solve or to structure or solve a marketing research problem. There are different components associated with this in the research design. You define the information. Then second is design the type of research that you would be engaged in, whether it is exploratory, descriptive, or causal. Specify the measurements as well as the scaling procedure. So based upon the time frame of what we have today, I will pick up this. Otherwise, I can go into depth in each of these specifics here. I would also like to give a quick demo by going through the complete journey as well. So I'll see how we can schedule it. Okay. Then construct and pre-test a questionnaire. If it's an interviewing technique that you're making use for, structured or an unstructured form of interview, as well as any other forms of data collection like survey methods, observations, or other methods that you are engaging in. Then specify the sampling process as well as the sampling size. Again, it's highly critical to understand these concepts as well. Okay, and how do you derive at a sample size? For example, you do a survey and collect. Should you go in and collect 200 sample or 500 or 1,000? What should be the ideal scenario that you should be doing it for? And similarly, if you're engaged into a qualitative study by which you are conducting an interview, what is the whether you should go in for 20 or 30 or 50, what is the phase in which you should stop conducting additional interviews? So these are some of the considerations that you should be looking in as part of your sampling process as well as the sampling size. Okay? And develop a plan for the data analysis. So all these are something which should be included as part of your research design. Okay. As I said, research design would include exploratory or conclusive. So in case of exploratory is more to explore about it. I could conduct a qualitative study by which I want to explore the phenomena in order to understand some of the patterns, some of the behaviors, or some of the phenomena that exist in thought. And conclusive is again broken down into two parts, descriptive or causal. Descriptive could be either a cross-sectional or a longitudinal. So cross-sectional is something in which we collect the data at a point in time. Okay, whereas longitudinal is repeated over a certain periodicity. For example, I want to understand the change of consumer behavioral pattern of using the mobile payments, for example, pre-COVID, during the COVID, post-COVID. So the only difference between the two, cross-sectional and the longitudinal, is that since cross-sectional is taken at a point in time, it could vary from sample to sample. For example, if I do a single cross-sectional, it is at one point in time. Multiple, I can still do at two different stages, but the sample could be totally different. Whereas in case of longitudinal, the same respondents are being viewed over a period of time in order to understand the change in behavioral pattern for them. So that's a key differentiating factor between multiple cross-sectional and the longitudinal design. Okay. Some specific examples associated with each of them. If we look into exploratory, the objective is to provide insight and understanding. Information is needed is only defined loosely, and the process is quite flexible as well as unstructured with a small sample size. And the analysis would be making use of primary data, which is again qualitative in nature. Now, the findings would again be tentative. It is not something that could be generalized and come up with as stating about the hypothesis. So we could start with something like a proposition and then come up with, certain exploration of those phenomena. So the outcome would generally be followed by further exploratory or a conclusive research. In case of conclusive, we could test specific hypothesis and examine the relationship. If I say X leads to Y, so is it that X leads to Y, or is it Y leads to X? Or are there other intervening variables which needs to be looked into, or are there any control variables? Okay, so all this could be looked in from the point of view of coming to the conclusions and understanding those relationships. Information needed is clearly defined. The process of the research is formal and structured. And the sample would typically be large and representative, like what we do with a quantitative study. Okay, a large could be 250 to 500, depending upon the type of structure and the model that we have. The findings are used as inputs into decision making. Okay. Simple differentiating factor between exploratory, descriptive, and causal. Okay, now what I will do is, let me go through some of the specifics with respect to okay, let me take this first as an example, and then I will go through the demonstration part. Okay, now if I look into one of these different approaches, what we looked in here as part of the research design, I could use something like as an experimental design. So experimental design is a set of procedures which specifies the test units and how these units are to be divided into homogeneous subsamples. What are the independent variables or the treatments that are manipulated? What are the dependent variables which needs to be measured? And how the extraneous variables needs to be controlled. Extraneous variables are the variables which are other than independent variables that can affect the response of the test unit. For example, if we talk about a store size, some could be much larger, much bigger, and some could be smaller. Store location, whether it is in an urban or a rural, or is it in a very prime location, as well as the efforts being put in by the competition. So all these could be various exogenous variables which can make an effect, and hence we need to control them while we are making those measurements. So hence they are known as extraneous variables. Okay. Experimental design comes in various forms or various approaches that we could use it for, like a pre-experimental, true experimental, quasi, and statistical. I will give some example and then go through this. What is this one shot or a one group pre-test and a post-test, as well as the control group? I'll take an example and explain this part. Okay. So the example is, say we are working in a true industrial environment wherein we want to understand the effectiveness of training to the employees in the organization. What I do is, what typically organization will do is to understand about the effectiveness of a training. They would have a number of employees identified who will undergo a training, and then they will do an assessment after training. So this is one of the simplest way what could be done. But there are other approaches the organizations can make use of. So the actual training is what is being imparted to the employees of the organization. So one measure could be employees go through training and then assessment is done. The other method is before the employee goes in for the training, in order to understand the level of, the existing level or the knowledge of the employees, they could do an assessment before the training, and then they will get into the manipulation or what is known as the training in this scenario, and then do an assessment after. So a pre-test, going through the manipulation, and then a post-test. So this is one way. Okay. The other method is we need to understand whether this training has been very effective. So I could define a particular group. That means a group of employees, those who do not undergo the training. So they are known as a control group in which no training is imparted. Whereas experimental group is the one who will undergo the training. And then we could do the assessment or do a comparison between them. So how this could be done is, if I take into consideration only the post-test, that is after the training. So that means my control group, those who have gone through the training, I do an assessment after the training. And similarly for the control group who have not gone through the training, I do an assessment and do a comparison between. Or if I want to do a true experimental study in which I define both control group, experimental group, pre-assessment for both, and then post-assessment for both. And this is a very, very crucial sort of information that could be looked into from the effectiveness of the training. Okay. I hope this is clear to everyone about with an example of experimental study in a typical HR environment in order to understand about the effectiveness of training being imparted on the employees.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yeah. A similar thing could be done in social environment as well. I will give you another example. My wife has done an experimental study with children by making use of standardized scale to understand about the. Does somebody have a question? I'm getting a lot of background noise. Does somebody have a question? Dr. Meena Kumari, can I request you to please mute everyone? Sheetal Nehere, do you have a question?
It's already muted, sir. Anybody is Sheetal?
Yeah, Sheetal Nehere.
See, we need to mute everyone. I request you to unmute yourself. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Sure. Thanks, ma'am.
Yeah. Thank you, sir. Just show me.
Okay. That's a key thing when we have large number of participants. If any one of them starts, speaking in between, out of the turn, it becomes quite kind of noise what we hear. Okay. Sheetal Nehere, can you please mute yourself? I'm getting a lot of this background noise.
Sheetal, please mute yourself. Give me the host. I'll do it.
Or can you remove the participant from this part? It's too. Yeah. Oh, they're just unmuted. Okay. Now still those background noise. Okay.
One Mr. Praveen is also.
Okay.
Yeah. Praveen, could you please mute yourself? Yeah, done. Done, okay. Sir. Kindly continue. Yeah. Sorry for the inconvenience.
Thank you, ma'am. Okay. So what we see is this is typically what we looking for in the as an experimental study, which could be used in various domains. I've taken this one as an example from the point of view of an HR training effectiveness. Similarly, it could be deployed in various environments or various domains that we look in from the management as well as from the social sciences. Okay. Now, there are certain limitations as well, which comes in as part of the experimental design, because if you look into the what it has to be done, okay, pre-test, post-test, control group, experimental group, I'm doing manipulations and all. When I say manipulation, is nothing but intervention. The training is what we are talking about in this scenario. So for this, there has to be, various resources required in order to measure them. So identify how would you administer the pre-test, post-test for control groups, for the experimental groups. What kind of instruments to be used in for? How would you measure the effectiveness associated with this? So there are a lot of these things which needs to go in as part of their research design for the experimental study. So the limitation comes in with respect to the time, cost, as well as administration. It is quite time consuming. For example, if the training itself is for 6 months, that means you need to plan up in such a way that your pre-test is being done for both experimental and the control group much prior to the start of the session. And once the training is completed, you need to again do a post-test for both these groups. So the time factor is again very critical. Then comes in with the cost. The experiments are expensive due to the requirement of experimental group, control group, and multiple measurements. Again, if you're doing some, making use of some standardized test, which needs to be procured, which actually measures both, pre and the post. The administration by itself, it may be impossible in measuring the human activity to control. For example, if we talk about the same training scenario, is it the effectiveness of the training imparted as per the schedule, or has the employee gone through the other trainings or other sessions from other places that has created this kind of impact? So all those again needs to be looked into, controlled as well as part of this, this study. Hence, administration again becomes a key area that needs to be looked into. Okay. Now, moving on further, in the measurement and scaling, what I would do is, I'll be talking more on the reliability, validity, and all. So I will go through with a quick demonstration based upon the time that we have. I'll spend the next few minutes related with this. So typically, this is one sample that I've collected for. This is not a cooked up data, it's a live data that I have collected from 75 respondents. Okay, I hope you all can see my screen, the Excel file.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, perfect. So I'll give a quick demo on how do we work with it. This is a raw data. That means this is whenever you create your own questions by which you collect, say, the name, email ID, and some demographic information, as well as based upon the questions or the factors that you defined in for. I've got total 20 questions in this. So, and you download it from, say, the Google's survey method that you have used for using Google Forms, and then you download this data. So how should you go about by analyzing this? So there are certain things which are known as pre-checks, data consistency check, before you actually put it into SPSS or other softwares for doing the statistical analysis. So in order to do that, though we do collect the email and the full name and all, this is something that we will not use it. This is not something which is useful. Okay. What I will do first is I will demonstrate this, and then if you have any questions, please do feel free to ask. Okay, and if you want a sample of this, you can use it with any of your current data as well. If you have already collected some survey, you can make use of it, or if you want this data, do let me know. Okay. So a typical one is, for example, these are the two things that we will not use as part of our study because email, full names and all are not relevant at all. So, but we do collect them in order to understand whether the same respondent should not, provide the inputs more than once. Okay, so that could solve a specific purpose, but not for any statistical analysis. Gender is again required only and only if you want to do a moderation analysis, wherein you want to understand whether the characteristics that exhibits are common across the board or are they different for example, for male or for female. Similarly for the age group, and similarly for some of these demographic information that you could collect in for as part of your study. What is important is, now I have got these 20 different questions, and I have collected on a Likert scale 1 to 7. Okay. Now the different checks that we would go in for before I actually start looking into the statistical analysis, the first thing is to do a quick check on all these. Okay, for this, what I would do is, I hope you are familiar with what are the, or let me go through this slide, wherein I would talk about some of these concepts associated with this, about the reliability and the data cleaning and the data consistency check. Okay, let me come to this slide directly. So the first thing what you would check for is, in the data consistency, you identify the data, whether they are out of range, whether they're logically inconsistent or have extreme values. So typically what this means is, when we say out of range, I'm collecting the data on a scale of 1 to 7. Has somebody given a score which is 0 or beyond 7 as well? Okay, something which is logically inconsistent. Okay, what does this mean? This could be, for example, if I've collected the age as well as the marital status. Somebody who's less than 17 years of age and is married. Okay, so that is inconsistent. So I can look for such anomalies by reviewing the data to understand if these exist for. Okay, and similarly, if they have any extreme values, Likert scale may not, but in other cases it could be, and that has to be looked in from the point of view of understanding the outliers and how do you ensure that these outliers do not influence your data and then take a decision accordingly. So these extreme values needs to be closely examined as part of the study. Okay, and then the first thing what we would look for is, one is the missing response, and then take a decision about if there are missing responses, how could you do it? Now the question comes in is, if you're doing, for example, collecting the survey data as part of your Google survey, okay, why should you get blank or missing values? Okay? It can happen in a scenario in which when a respondent fills in those questions are not being marked as mandatory. In that scenario, if somebody misses answering any of the questions, it could come in as blank. So there are some checks that you could do as part of your study. That's number one. Secondly, the method that is preferable whenever you want to go in for publishing your research papers in good quality journals like ABDC journals, if you say that I've collected all my 500 plus respondents only using one method of Google survey, it might create a lot of those question marks. So ideal method would be to have a mix of this. One is you can use your Google survey. Second is use something what is known as a mall intercept, or print your questionnaires in a sheet of paper and then go to the respondents, ask them to fill in that. So that means you're using two different approaches to collect the data. Now there are various other considerations as well when we get into this. I don't think I will go into too much of detail today, but it should be a kind of, whenever you're doing these kind of surveys, it should take into consideration all of this whenever, otherwise there are different biases which could come into the play, and there are multiple approaches, multiple biases and multiple approaches in order to minimize this. So as a research scholar, we need to look into all these areas in order to ensure that the biases are minimized at the time of the data collection. Okay. So when you collect this data by using some of these, manual method, even that could have blanks, or even the values that, for example, after collecting the data manually, the research scholar would update the Excel file. In that case, by mistake, instead of having 5, I say minus any number, or instead of 5, I make it as 8. that could also create issues, because the Likert scale is from 1 to 7. Anything which is beyond this acceptable range is an issue. Okay, so all those needs to be looked in for as part of your study. So that's what we talk about. One is consistency, and second would be the missing response. Then comes, how do I treat this missing response? Okay, one simple is case-wise deletion. So simply what I do is I identify where it is blank and then simply delete them, that particular respondent or that particular row. There are other approaches as well. Now this could be substitute a neutral value. What is a neutral value? If I'm doing it on a scale of 1 to 7, neutral value, is it 3 or is it 4? Okay, so based upon that, you can simply replace it or substitute it with this a middle value of the scale that you have, that becomes a neutral value. Or substitute an imputed response, in which the respondent's pattern of responses to other questions are used to impute or calculate a suitable response. So what does this mean? For example, if I look into, as these 4 are, so I'm using a reflective scale in which each factor has got 4 questions. So if I look into something like this, I say, okay, if this is missing, I look into what are the previous questions to which the way that the respondent has replied for, and then I can substitute based upon the pattern of responses to the other questions within that. So I can say it could be 6 or it could be 7 as well. Okay. So that's the second option. Case-wise deletion I have done. Similarly, pair-wise deletion. So instead of discarding all cases of all with any missing values, the researcher uses only the cases or respondents with complete response for each calculation. I can show with an example here about pair-wise deletion, wherein you can look in for each of the factors and then make them pairs. In order to understand based upon the sample size. So there are various considerations associated with this as well. When you look in for the pairs, for example, if we have got A, B, and C, if any one of them is missing, should you be discarding the whole thing? Or would you say, okay, A and B is fine, C is not there, or A and C, B and C. So like this, you can create various pairs and look for the ones based upon the respondents, how they replied for, which one to be used as part of your study. So it's a very interesting one, but I need some more time in order to explain this with an example. But this could be looked in from the point of view of when you cannot have additional responses, for example, but if you have a luxury of having, say, 500 to 600 respondents, and if the missing values are typically very few, you can simply go and delete them. So as a research scholar, you need to evaluate and decide for which of these approaches that you need to use and for. Okay. And then I will just quickly demonstrate each of this, and then comes about the scale transformation. Now, typically the scale transformation is being used for, I hope you all are familiar with what a Z-score is. Okay, we normally use it multiple times about using the Z-score. Softwares actually does it internally, but in certain cases, we may have to understand and transform this in order to standardize the scale. So typically what this means is if I'm collecting one of the factors on say 7-point Likert scale, in the other thing I'm doing it on a 5-point Likert scale, or in a semantic differential scale, you know, all these are not something which are compatible to each other. For example, I could say I'm collecting the data in kg and I'm collecting the data in pounds. Okay, the statistics cannot be same across the board. So for that, we might need to use standardization. It's a very simplistic one, which is xi minus x bar divided by s. Okay, in order to obtain the standardized scale. As I said, there are a lot of softwares like SPSS and all which are existing, which actually does this internally based upon what we use it for. But as a scholar, you need to be familiar with, because there are certain scales like attitude. Okay, you may not be able to do it on a 7-point Likert scale, but you are collected on a semantic differential scale. Hence, you want to standardize this in order to make sure you're able to do a comparison between multiple approaches to be used in for. Okay. So how do we go about these approaches? The first, and so as I said, there are total how many? 675 of these respondents data that I've collected. One is, you must be quite familiar with Microsoft Excel for creating the tables and adding on various columns and all. I assume that you all are familiar with. So if it is a small data, since I have looked into this deeply, I can understand this. I say, okay, these are blanks. Okay, the first and foremost is to understand the blank. You can also make use of formulas like equals to is blank in order to check whether a particular cell entry is blank or not. So I can do multiple ones like this. I can say, okay, if is blank, okay, I can build my own formulas like this. I can say if it is blank, in that case, I say it is 0, otherwise 1. So I get a lot of these and say, and I can do a copy paste in order to look in for the other column. You can build and see, okay, anything which is 0 indicates that there is a blank cell. Then I can take a decision, okay, what should I do with this blank cell? If you're having a table form, you can simply create in one place and then it simply gets replicated across. So for the sake of the demonstration purposes, I will say, okay, I've got 2 blanks and I take a decision of what should I do. I simply go ahead and delete this. Okay, so this is the first and foremost thing. Second is, we also looked into the consistency. Now, typically, again, what I should have is, it's a 7-point Likert scale. All the data that I have entered into here should be between 1 to 7. Anything which is less or beyond this, I should be able to identify. So again, the method is you look for, there are various approaches for doing it. You can use it in SPSS or you can do it in Excel as well. Typically, I would say that all such kind of analysis I do in Excel. Once I have got a clean data, then I put it into SPSS or Smart PLS for doing further analysis. You can look for any approach which is comfortable to you. Okay. So how do I do this is, again, I could make use of formula. Since it should be within a range of 1 to 7, I can use either a nested if loop or I can use a VLOOKUP in order to identify this. Since in this scenario, I've got 1, which is beyond this, or I can use something like a conditional formatting. Conditional formatting and all will be good only if you have got a small amount of data. But typically in quantitative techniques, we normally go in for large amount of data, which is something 200 to 400, 600, 800 and all. It is humanly not possible to simply look into with conditional formatting by the naked eye to look for which cell has been colored, which is not colored. The best approach is to make use of the formulas and then build for any such kind of variations you can easily choose for. So here I know which one it is. So I can say, okay, this is incorrect. So there are different approaches for this. If I have something incorrect data, either go back to the field and get it correctly from the respondent. In case there are no human errors, if there are human errors, go back and check for the original data that you had, which was filled in from the respondents. Do those checks. If not, okay, for easy for today, I will simply delete it. So what I have now is 73. The first one is a column. So I've got 73 different respondents data that I have. Okay, now what is the next step? Okay, the next step after we collect the data should be, once I've done this consistency check, in order to understand if the respondents have actually, what we normally feel is whether the respondents have seen the questionnaire, read through the questionnaire and responded, or simply have they done all tick, 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 tick. That could be identified by making us a simplistic one with a standard deviation. Okay, so what I can do is I can just say standard deviation. I hope you all understand about standard deviation, right? Okay, and for these Likert scale, these 20 different questions, and I simply use this. I can use filter condition. I can choose anything which is 0. The first is to look for 0. So what typically this would mean is this respondent has actually simply given a score of 7 at all places. I can say, okay, the respondent has actually not read through the questions or not looked into it, because you cannot get something same across the board. So I can take decisions accordingly. I can simply go ahead and delete these rather than making in for any other thing. So I delete these rows from my respondents data. Now, the other question comes in, is it only 0 or are there any other values that I should be looking in for? Again, it is based upon the researcher's decision again. For example, if I see this, In this scenario, all are 6 except these 2. In this scenario, all are 6 except again a couple of them. Okay, then it could be the researcher's decision in order to understand whether it should be only 0, or could it be any such kind of value that is permissible or allowable as part of the sample that you have. Otherwise, this could lead to your statistical analysis. My preference would always be remove the ones which are having a standard deviation of 0, that means with no variation between the questions. Okay. Now there are other considerations, the way the questionnaire is built as well. You can incorporate this with making use of negative questions, and then make the transpose it accordingly as part of your study, so that you could get some sort of view whether the respondents have actually read through the question and then replied or not. So there are some bases that could be built in as part of your questionnaire, and some from this kind of analysis that you do it for. Okay. So for the time being, I'll just remove it, only the ones which are 0. So this, now I have done the consistency check. I have done the data cleaning activity. Now my data is all fine. Now how should I put it in say SPSS for doing further analysis? So what I've done is I simply created one which includes about the details, and then I will be making use of this to port it. So how do I do this is simply, for example, I said email and all this is not required. I remove it. Okay, I'll just get rid of these columns. I'll say delete. Now, in order to make a particular column to be unique, I would have some sort of identifier. Identifier is just a running number, okay, in order to define each of them. So I've got an ID. Now, gender is something which should be looked in as male and female. So do I want to do some analysis? I could say 0 means male and 1 is female. Okay. I could do something like this and then transpose this. How could you do it? Again, very simplistic one. Within Excel, you can have some methods, or you can create your own a quick formulas as well, and then update this. I can say if female equals to if the value equals to female, it is 0, else it is 1. Okay. Similarly, for the age group, I can create a small table and then do a VLOOKUP and then add on to that. And for the other, so for the time being, what I will do is I'll simply get rid of this. But these are something which should be used in for if you're doing the moderation analysis, for example, in order to understand the characteristics, whether they're similar or dissimilar across the samples that you have collected for. So now I have total 20 questions for 69 different respondents. So my data is all clean and perfect that I can port it across. So how do I do that is I could define each of them. Okay, just remove this for the demonstration purposes. What I have is these are the different questions. I simply did a transpose of copying from there to here, and this is an identifier. And now I can go into SPSS and perform the activity. So typically what we do is we got a data view and the variable view. I can define the variables and what all does it mean for. So I'll do a quick one. So these are my different variables. Okay, then comes the label. I'm just doing a copy and paste from Excel. It's much easier to look in for and manipulate them. And all this I can look in for whether what type of they are and what type of measure should it be. For example, in all these scenarios, it should be a scale. So I quickly go ahead and define them. It gives in all these confirmations and all. So my data is now, all variables are defined and all done. I go into the data view and I would simply go ahead and it's a quick one, whether you have, I don't need the standard deviation, whether you have 100, 50 or 10,000, it's all the same. Okay, you can quickly do it, or you can make use of some of these options to input and export. Now, since we do not have any decimals, it doesn't make any sense to do it. So this kind of definition could be done at the, or checks could be done at the beginning. And I'll quickly do this in order to make sure that the data is all consistent. Something like this. So I have all this done. my data is now ready, by which I should be able to work with Microsoft with the spaces for doing further statistical analysis. Now, if I go back to my example of structural equation modeling, there are some checks which need to be done. For example, you want to understand about the prerequisites and pre-checks, whether it follows a normal curve. You need to understand about the skewness, kurtosis, some different checks that you could do as part of this, come into descriptive statistics, and then get in for the further analysis. Let me quickly go through, so how do we classify the data and what kind of analysis and the test that we could do is, the data would be classified if you're looking into the univariate, metric or non-metric, with one sample, two sample. I hope you all understand about what these one sample t-test and similarly t-test with independent and related or paid sample t-test are. I can give a quick explanation for this if we look into some of this, what we have. So if I go back to the previous example of the experimental study, experimental design, what I described here. Say my example is, I have only the experimental group, okay? I don't have any control group. If I got only experimental group, then I want to understand whether the training has been effective or not. So I have done a pre-test and a post-test for say 50 employees. So what kind of test would I do to understand, to statistically infer whether there has been some improvement or not? I could make use of a paid sample t-test. That means it is exactly the same sample for the pre and the post. So I could use a paid sample t-test. Similarly, if I want to use something like, say, a control group with, say, the post-test, pre and the post, then it becomes an independent sample t-test. Okay, I hope you understand this concept now. Yeah, so when I have two different separate groups in which I want to analyze about whether the trainings has been effective or not, for two different groups, I would make use of an independent sample t-test. Within the same, for example, I do a pre and post for experimental or pre and post for the control group. In this scenario, I would make use of a paid sample t-test. Okay, so these are what I have been referring to in the scenario for the different techniques what are being used. Similarly, if they are non-metric, what kind of test we could do? And if they are multivariate, we have various options to be looked in for. I will typically use, for the time being, with the factor analysis on how do we go ahead and analyze them. So once I have quoted this data, I could look in for the reliability and validity as well. Okay, let me go through the concept of these before I come into the factor analysis. I will go in a very logical way. Experimental we have done. Now this is what it is about. So for each of the scale that we have used in for, we look in for reliability and validity. With the reliability, okay, you would have gone through with Cronbach alpha. Okay, which typically talks about the internal consistency of a particular scale, so there are various approaches that we could look in, whether to do a test and retest, alternate forms, or internal consistency checks. So typically, test and retest, what it means is, the type of test that I would perform is, within my scale, I would do first collect the data. Then I would collect again for the second time, that would become a retest. So test and retest, this could be used in for ensuring that I measure this. Okay, and that's what we have. In a test and retest, respondents are administered identical set of scale items at two different times. So A and B at two different times, and both are then being collected in order to test and doing a reliability. Or I could use an alternate form reliability, wherein two equivalent forms of the scales are constructed and the same respondents are measured at two different times. So for example, I could have a huge scale. I can split my scale, my questionnaire, into two different parts. But that's what is known as alternate forms of reliability. And then within the internal consistency checks, there are other options like using the split half reliability. So all the data that I've collected are actually, say for example, I've collected 500 samples. as part of my study. Then I split them or divide them into two halves, the first half and the second half, each of 250, and then I do a reliability test. Or I could make use of Cronbach alpha in order to check the internal reliability of the scale. So typically, when I get this kind of output, what we would check for is the reliability, the Cronbach alpha, and understand whether, based upon the numbers what we get or the value for the Cronbach alpha, we look into whether they are acceptable or do they require any kind of updations by the scholar. When I talk about updations, is it become applicable as part of my study, or do I need to drop any of the questionnaire questions as part of the scale or not? Okay. With respect to the validity, there are some simplistic ones and there are some difficult ones. Difficult in the sense that I need to have additional software for performing it. So validity, one is content validity, which is also referred to as face validity. So if you draw an analogy and talk exactly of what it actually means is, you're looking into the content of the questionnaire. So that means you have developed a questionnaire, you have taken a print of it, and then you are reviewing each of the questions and then validating that whether it is appropriate, whether it is correct or not. For that, you could also make use of, for example, an expert who is expert in that particular field, who can review the questionnaire and then say whether questions are correct or they are ambiguous or any changes are required, so that it could be easily understood by the respondents when they fill it. The other thing what we look into from the construct validity are convergent, discriminant, and nomological validity. Okay, a very simplistic example is for the convergent, what we look for is each questions or the items should converge to its factor. That's a convergent validity. In case of discriminant validity, it is the extent to which measure does not correlate with other constructs. So for example, if we have having 4 different constructs, each construct should be distinct to each other. And that's what a discriminant validity is. And similarly, the nomological validity is the extent to which scale correlates theoretically in theoretically predicted ways with measures of different but related constructs. Okay. So these are the different validities that we go in through by making use of an additional software, which is an AMOS, apart from the spaces for identifying the construct validity. So for today, for the time being, what I'll do is I'll make use of this for demonstrating about the reliability measures. So how do we do that in this scenario is, so what I have is PU1 to PU4 is one factor, and similarly others. Okay. So the first step would be is sorry, I'll just take a moment. So the first step what we are talking about is with respect to the reliability analysis. So the method in SPS is analyze, scale, reliability analysis, identify the different factors. So what I have is, I'll go one by one. The first is PU1 to PU4. Under the statistics, identify, this is very, very critical, scale if item deleted. I'll explain this with the output. Okay. There are various other options. You must know about the inter-item correlations as well. This is again very critical. If you are getting some, issues with discriminant validity, you need to understand about these. And similarly, whenever you want to go ahead with the next analysis, you need to make sure that inter-item correlations are all perfect. And if you are trying to drop a particular item, again, this would be required. But for the demonstration purpose, I'll make it very simplistic one. I've selected the first 4 items or the questions as part of this. And the modulus for the Cronbach alpha is choose OK. Now what it gives me, the result is a Cronbach alpha for the 4 items. The total number of valid respondents, or N, what we see here is 69. and number of respondents which are excluded is 0. So total for 69, it gives the result. And the reliability statistics of Cronbach alpha is 0.894 for 4 items, and which is perfectly fine. I can go to each of the items in order to check the Cronbach alpha. I would go item by item. For the first one, it says it is 0.8. It is scale mean if item deleted and all. So key thing what we would look for is correlated item to total correlation, the second last column and the last column. So it is 0.715, 0.813, 0.796, and 0.743, which is much fine. Anything beyond 0.7 is all fine. Now again, how do we know whether it should be 0.7 or 0.6? How do we calculate this to be 0.7 or not? Again, there are various statisticians who have analyzed this and then come into these conclusions, what we should put in for. And you need to look into those kind of statistic analysis. Higher is the easiest one to what I see is most of the people would be quoting in for. So you can refer to those research papers or the various statisticians who have gone for this. Never ever quote in for any individual because you have seen somebody's video or you have attended anybody's webinars. Always make use of an authentic source whenever you are quoting them. And then the last column indicates if you delete this item, what will be the impact on the Cronbach alpha, which is here. So if you delete the PU1, the value is 0.715. And if you delete this value, 0.894 will go below 2.882. So I don't have to delete. In case of any issues with any specific one, the first thing it will show here to be very low. And secondly, this value would increase from what is displayed in here. That would give about the wherein the researcher has to then take a decision about to delete a specific item if the reliability is low as per the permissible value. Okay, this is the first step. The second step would be similar to this. I would then do it for all other. Okay, I'll use the same as standard. And here in this scenario, what I see is 0.905. In which is all fine. Okay, from the values, I can quickly review them and say, okay, the second factor is also fine. Then I come into the third one, which is the third factor for habit 1 to habit 4. Shows okay. Again, for 69, 0.904. And individually, if I look into each one of them, these are all fine. Then I look into the next. For trust TR1 to TR4, move it on to the right side for doing the analysis, which is 0.936 for 4 items, and all of them are again, as per the permissible values. So all these are again fine. And then I do for the fifth factor that I have defined as part of my study. Okay, and which is again fine. Now remember the sample size I have is only 70 something. Okay, so for this it is all perfect. So hence my sample is quite adequate by which I can go ahead with further analysis with this reliability. And then what I should also remember is not only doing it for individual factor, I should also look in for the overall ones in order to understand. ID is just an identifier, so I'm not including that for the overall as well. So for these 20 different items, the overall reliability of the scale, all factors put together is 0.946. So both are required to be done. And similarly, whenever you're writing a research paper, you need to make sure that you document each of them. That means if you are removing any items, you need to have those values defined or identified, and then why did you delete them? So that would become a validation associated with this. So once we are fine with the reliability analysis, then we can go ahead with the next step of analysis here. For example, if I do a factor analysis, I can say go into dimension reduction factors. ID is not required. I would put all these together without the ID and looking for the solution. So first thing what we need to look in for is the KMO, Barley, and test of sphericity. There are other things what we also look in for. For example, NT image is again critical whenever you're doing this. Maybe what I will do is I won't go into details about each one of them. Based upon the time factor, I need to make sure that I do some introduction on the qualitative study as well. So I'll quickly go through this demo. It then comes with the extraction. So I don't need a scree plot. I don't need unrotated factors. And here there are selections that you could make. The extraction should be based on either the eigenvalue or a fixed number of factors. If you know what should be the number of factors which are predefined based upon a theoretical model, you can make it specific for this. For the time being, I'll make it as the same eigenvalue. In the rotation, there should be a kind of repeated process. It should not be done only once. It's an iterative process. So typically, you need to look in for whether it is a Verimax or a Promax based upon the rotation method to be used in for. Okay. And accordingly, you can choose this. I want to have the display as well. Scores. This would come at the last one. That means, for example, if I look in for the factor analysis, once I'm happy with all the factors and the rotation, all that I've done, I'm able to obtain the clean factors. At the final stage, I can then save it. And this score can then, or the factor score can then be used for further analysis as part of my study. So it will, what actually it will do is it will create additional factors by writing them onto the same file. So as of now, I'm not doing it because I need to go ahead and check for whether my factors are fine or not. Okay, I can sort by size or I can suppress the small coefficients. Typically, I'll say those which are less than 4 should be suppressed for. Okay. So I get these as the KMO is 0.869, which is fine with the degree of freedom 190, significance is 0, which is fine. So this indicates I can go ahead and look for the further onto this. So if I look into the eigenvalue, this column would indicate about the variance and the total eigenvalue. What I get as part of this is 4 factors if it is greater than 1. What my model was, I had how many of them? Okay, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 factors. So if I take eigenvalue of 1 greater than, it may not be very relevant as part of my study. So what I could do is I should have at least, say, in the extraction, I should make it as if it is a predefined one. I could choose 5, but again, there has to be, justification associated with every step that you perform as part of the study based upon what you choose and why you choose for. Okay, so if I look into the output of what I have, so there are various cross loadings that I could see in here. I need to make sure that I am able to obtain clean factors. These factors are, for example, and how do we read this as factor number 1, in which I could see there are 4 of these items, TR 1, 2, 3, and 4. So these 4 are loaded onto the first factor. The second factor, there are multiple loadings, so cross loadings as well. So one factor, second. So these are not very, very correct. Similarly, if you look into the third one, again, there are multiple items which are being loaded onto this. So I need to make sure that I correct them. I would go in a sequence, step-by-step basis. I could also look in from the perspective of whether I should do an oblique or an orthogonal rotation. And based upon this, I could choose in for example, I go in for a different rotation. I could look in what are the values that I get. Okay. Now, these are fine. 0.4 is very, very less again. So this is something which is liable for deletion. And you can't get anything which is greater than 1. So this is another consideration that we need to look in for in order to make sure that these are all sorted out. So I can choose an appropriate rotation method. I won't go into too much of details now about the oblique and orthogonal rotation. It's all based upon the axis that we look in for, whether the X and Y axis are rotated with the same degree or different degrees when the rotation happens. So that needs to be looked in for again. Okay, so how do I resolve them is, for example, if I look in for HP2 is an issue, I would go in here and choose HP2, this particular item, I would remove it and then choose OK to run this, look for the output. Okay, so I would look in for the the pattern matrix. Now this has created some other issue. So I go back and reintroduce HB2. I bring it back to the place where it was. Okay, so instead of removing that, what I should be doing is looking in for the one which is liable for, say, PU1 is the lowest what I see here. I should ideally get rid of PU1 to be, which qualifies to be removed from the factor analysis. Then going further with this. Okay, so like this, I need to keep working on in order to make sure that I'm able to get some clean factor and output here. Like we have got this PU is fine, PEOU is fine, TR is fine, this is fine. So only issue I'm finding is with HB2. So this is also liable for this to be removed. Okay. Now my sample size is pretty small, but I'm still using it for the demonstration purposes here in order to make sure that I am able to, come up with something. Okay, so these are all fine. 1, 2, 3, 4 factors are fine. The last one has got an issue. So I need to again look back and then see, okay, why these are happening. Any amount of cross loadings needs to be removed again. For example, in this BI4, instead of being loaded onto the factor 5, it is being loaded on factor 1. So like this, I can keep looking into the ones which are liable for being removal as part of this. And sample size is again very contributory. Since it is only for demonstration purposes, I'm having a smaller set of sample. Okay, so like this, I keep working on in order to revise this. Ideally, what is recommended for is based upon the activity that we perform. My conceptual model has got 5 factors and 4 questions each, so total 20 questions. So what is being recommended is to have 4 to 10 times the number of items in a scale. And this is typically what has been recommended from SPSS point of view by higher. Okay, and similarly, if you are working on smart PLS, it is not too stringent with respect to the sample size. So based upon that, also we need to look in for what should be the, but 60, 70 is very, very less in order to perform this completely. Ideally, I should have a bigger sample size in order to do this. But still, I'm getting these results except for the BI. Okay, so because BI is still again cross-loaded with 2 different factors, factor number 3 and factor number 5. Accordingly, I might need to decide on or go in for additional data collection in order to purify the scale and come up with a clean pattern matrix. The next step for this is once I complete this, for example, if I say that I got a clean matrix, I would then save the factor scores, then I can use it either for the regression or I can then go in for using this into the MOS for doing the path analysis. Wherein I then define the dependent independent variables, draw the structure, do the the metrics and in the indices, looking for what the model is, going for the statistical analysis hypothesis, identifying which ones are supported and not supported. So depending upon this, I can then move on further with the statistical analysis. I think I would stop here with respect to the quantitative analysis, and let me open it up for questions before I move on to a brief introduction on qualitative, on what is qualitative, why should we be using qualitative study compared to quantitative, under which scenario should be using it. Okay, so let me open it up for questions. If you've got any questions, please feel free to ask. I think there are some questions in the chat. Okay, we'll start from the beginning. Okay, Alok Mohan. Yeah, are you there, Alok Mohan?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, Alok, your question is give an example of discriminant validity. Okay, so what typically this means is if I go back to my conceptual model, I hope you can see my screen, Alok.
Yeah, I can see that.
Yeah. Let me minimize this. Okay, if I go back to my model, what is shown here. Yeah. Okay. Consider something like this. This is what my model is. Okay. Now, how do I identify brand image. Brand image is a factor. Okay, I would ask different questions. I don't have a pen with me. So what I will do is I'll just make use of something to draw. Maybe I'll use some lines in order to demonstrate this. Okay, so for example, I have question 1. I'll use a different color for this in order to demonstrate this. I'll use choose a red. I'll choose a red color for this. Okay, say this is so what I have is how many 4 different questions per factor. Okay. So I'm just drawing this to represent question number 1, 2, 3, 4. That's all I'm doing, nothing else. Okay. So the way I would do is something like this. So that means each of my factor would have 4 questions. So consider this brand image has 4 questions which I collect from the respondents. Okay. Brand image is separate than perceived awareness. Yeah. So what we do in terms of the validity check is the first step is to identify that all these 4 questions actually merges to this particular factor. Okay, that is one. The second, when we talk about discriminant validity, is this factor is totally different compared to this factor, and this is what we are statistically validating it, not by just giving a questions or framing a questions and looking into a conceptual model, but we are validating this statistically. Okay, so when we talk about discriminant validity, it's a common word. Okay, discriminate, that means 2 factors are able to discriminate each other or distinguish each other. This factor is totally separate compared to the second factor. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that for that is done statistically, for which we need to make use of the tool like Amos. Okay.
Yeah, that is what I mean. It got clear once you did this analysis over SPSS, so it was clear in there itself. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
The next question. How do I go back to the chat? Yeah, that was for Alok Moon. The next question is Sandhya. It's really awesome session. Thank you so much. Okay. My factors are already validated by other research. So do I also need to verify them in? Okay. Yatika. Are you there, Yatika, on the call?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so you're asking that the factors are already validated by other researcher. Do I also need to verify them in my research? Good question, Yatika. Now, typically what happens when you talk about the factors is these factors could have been used by other researchers. Now, how do you know that you can depend on other researchers? That's number one. Secondly, other researchers could have validated this in a different context. When I talk about the context, it could be a different period of time, it could be a different market, it could be a different respondents, it could be in different field of study. How is that common across to you? Are you with me?
Yes, sir. Right, sir.
So whenever you are making use of any scale, you need to make sure that it is relevant for your respondents. Hence, see, everything that we do in social sciences as well as management, be it HR, marketing, everything is to do with social sciences. And we collect the data from the respondents. We cannot get into the mind of the customers in order to understand why or how. We cannot get the cognitive behavior of the consumer. So it's very, very critical in order to understand them. Hence, to get to know about the way that respondents have replied to the different questions, you must validate them as part of your study as well. Okay, yes. So when I talk about validity, everything right from reliability, all validity should be done before you actually come up with the hypothesis testing.
Okay, sir. Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions on this before we move on to the next step of qualitative study? Okay, I guess no. Okay, I can understand there are a lot of things that we could do. You know, since this was a very basic one, I wanted to still give you some overview associated with the quantitative study of how do we go ahead with the data collection and the analyzing of the data. Okay, now I'll go ahead with my slides. I'll give some brief about the qualitative study as well, so that you understand the differences between qualitative and quantitative and why do we need to use them. Okay. Let me directly go to the qualitative research methods. I think how much time do I have? Another some 10-15 minutes or so. I'll try to wrap up in the next 10-15 minutes. Now, why should a researcher get into using a qualitative study? There are various reasons or the rationales associated with this. The first is very basic. It is based upon the preference or experience of the researcher. Something like I'm pretty good in quantitative. Similarly, there could be some researcher who are good in qualitative. So they might get into using the qualitative method of performing the research, or it's based upon the orientation and temperamentally which is suited for that type of work. So because I'm not very good at statistics, I might tend to do into a more qualitative study. That could be one. And second, the way that the researchers themselves are trained in those disciplines like anthropology, Hermeneutic, the different philosophies that they could get into, that could be the first reason. Second is based upon the research user. Okay, so the decision makers who are working in creative environment of advertising, copy, or the development of brand personalities. So we are talking about the users now. So in order to get into that, so we are talking about the creative environment of advertising or the brand personalities. In order to understand them, simply giving a set of questionnaire will not help. So that would be one area that needs to be looked into in order to use qualitative. The third, when there are sensitive information, for example, it could be in a typical work environment, say in organizations. You want to understand about why the attrition rate is very high. If you simply ask 2-3 questions, it may not lead to anything. It could be, the work culture. It could be various other specifics that you want to get into while getting the responses from the employees. So when there are such critical information, sensitive information, for example, some might not even like to talk about their bosses at all. So in that case, how do you get to know those information? For that, simply having a survey method, a questionnaire may not be sufficient. In order to get to those sensitive information, you might need to get involved in a qualitative research. Okay. It could lead to what corporate performances, plans, societal health, products, medicines consumed. A lot of things could come in for. Okay, it could be based upon. Some would say that it invades their privacy. How could you make sure that you do not get into that kind of domain or embarrass them or have a negative impact on their ego or the status? So when there are such critical sensitive informations, you might need to go in for a qualitative research which predominantly makes use of structured or an unstructured interview mode. And the next is about subconscious feelings, wherein the respondent may be unable to provide accurate answers to the questions that tap their subconscious mind. For example, if we talk about values or emotional drives or motivations, okay, they are into an abstract form. Simply asking a survey question, you can't get into those. So the preferred method or an approach would be a qualitative research. Or if the phenomena is complex, wherein you want to understand the type of music a person prefers. You can't simply say whether I like Bollywood or classical music or a particular variant associated with this, but you want to understand why do they prefer a type of music. For that, you might need to explore further in order to get, because it's all based upon their feelings and their cognitive behavior. As soon as it comes into their emotions, to understand about what goes into their head, you might need to understand those complex phenomena by probing them further, or to get the holistic dimension, in order to gain a comprehensive as well as complete picture of the whole context of the phenomena. And if you are involved in developing a new theory, in that case, again, you might get involved into defining those constructs and developing them by making use of a qualitative research. So typically what I have done as part of my study is I conducted first a qualitative study in order to understand the phenomena. So see, one method is, if I go back to quantitative study, I've got different models, predefined models existing. I can simply use those models and then say, okay, this is what my result is. Rather than doing that, based upon the domain of my study, I want to understand the factors which are considered important by the consumers and then get into a quantitative study. For that, to understand the phenomena or the factors that are relevant, I could first do a qualitative and then move on to a quantitative study. So that could also be an approach that researchers normally take in for, rather than simply adapting a scale from another context or another domain. Okay, so what we see also here is, if you want to understand the social processes and the structures or the cultures, though this diagram typically indicates about various societal changes that we look into, so today what we are in the past 18 months or 1.5 years is more to do with the pandemic scenario. So if you want to understand about the usage or shifting pattern in the society, I could look in for by making use of the qualitative study. The experiences of the people, the meaning and the insights, as well as the journey in understanding of what you understood. For all those, again, we need to make use of qualitative study. So researchers may undertake qualitative research in order to define a research problem or to support quantitative, descriptive, or a causal. So as I said, rather than simply adapting a scale, adapting the factors, you could look in from the qualitative study about what are important and then move to the quantitative study that gives you a much more solidification of the concept that you're using as part of your study. To generate hypothesis, identify variables that should be included in quantitative approach, or it may be used after or in conjunction with quantitative approach. That means you do qualitative, then quantitative, or quantitative followed by a qualitative study. Either of them are fine, which could be used. There are different approaches that could be used in the qualitative study. Okay, for example, depth interviews or a focus group interviews, projective techniques or discussion guides. Okay, any of these approaches could be used in order to get to know about the, like we looked into the rationale or the reasons why we could do qualitative studies. So these are the approaches to be used in for. So if you look into the depth interview, it is also a one-on-one interview, which usually takes between 20 minutes to 1 hour, depending upon the context of the study, of why you want to perform, what the objectives of the study is, how do you want to infer the results. So you could look in for those. It provides important information for targeting, positioning, as well as product design. Interview will often probe consumers to get more information. And whenever you conduct these depth interview, we always go in for recording the session, which could be a video recording or an audio recording, so that we can go back and whenever we conduct these interviews, we can't remember everything what has been discussed between the interviewee and the interviewer. So we typically record them so that we can play back later on and record those findings or record those what has been discussed. It comes in with different approaches for transcribing, then getting into the content analysis, then drawing inferences out of each of this. I don't think I will have too much of time in order to discuss this, so I'll briefly look for some of the data collection methods and then I would stop there. So the focused group is wherein you've got a small group of participants, usually 8 to 10. And the way that you could have the respondents are, they are recruited through a screener question. Okay, a screener question is simply a qualifier. For example, typically in a quantitative study, what would you do? So you'll say my sample should be those who are, say, above 25 years of age. So in that case, that becomes as a qualifier or a filter condition. The same is what we would do here. We would say, which type of respondents should be part of my focus group? I can screen them based upon a simple questionnaire, which becomes as a qualifier, whether should I include them or should I discard them as part of my sample or the focus. Okay. So this is a screener question. You can ask a series of questions in order to filter them out. And then there are other methods, the projective technique, which, something like what you could look for the word association, wherein the first word that comes to your mind. You would have seen this even in the movies as well. They would say, okay, the first word, you provide a word, and then what is the association that you could give in for this? The first thing which comes out. It's quite popular in some of the movies as well. These are being used in, in various settings and scenarios. Say, for example, you want to understand some criticalities associated with children and how they behave. How could you make out with what question should you be asking them? So this is another approach that could be looked in for. Okay, sentence completion, or a photo visual, or a storytelling, or a role play. So you define what it should be, you provide some of these stimulus, and then they come up with stories. Okay, photo visual and storytelling is also a very excellent approach, because there are certain things that you cannot get into the mind of the respondents to get to know about the truth. So you can give them a photo, and then they could talk about it, by which they would imagine, and wherein the respondent can get much richer and quality data as part of the studies. The other, from the consumer's perspective, there could be observational research, in which it could be a non-participant or a participant observation. So typically what this means is, when we talk about in a naturalistic environment, the way the consumers would behave. Say, I want to understand, in my supermarket, there are different aisles. So as a consumer, whenever we go in for, there are things that we would look for in order to understand whether we should purchase or not purchase a particular product. So in the rack, ideally, the way that the marketers would observe for is, from which particular rack a consumer is picking up the item, whether it is on the top or just at the height or below. When they pick for, what is that they would be looking in for in that item, the packaging, product, price, whatever it is. So there would be something examining it, and then do they actually buy it, put it in their cart, or do they put it back in the rack? So these are very, very critical for the marketers to understand about the behavioral pattern of the consumers when they go in for the market for the shopping. It could be done by which a researcher is, standing along with the consumers as an observant, or it could be done by using these devices like a camera which is there and which actually captures all this information, which could be analyzed later on. So this, instead of doing in a lab setup, these kind of observations are being done in a live environment in which a consumer is actually going in for buying, and there would be a researcher who will be observing about the behavioral pattern of it. Okay, these are some of the recording mechanisms. This is something which is a part of my study, wherein I have done the the approach that I've used in order to use the qualitative study. Multiple things that I could talk about. I think in the interest of time, probably I would stop here, because there are other things that could be looked into. For example, once I collect the data, what do I do with it? How do I transcribe it? How do I create contents code? What are thematic analysis? How do I ensure that my study has got rigor associated with it? And what approaches to be used in for? So multiple things that we could look in as part of this study. Okay, so what I would stop here is, whenever we look in for the different qualitative study, this actually emulates some of those. As defined by Guba and Lincoln, is that the issue of quality is not well resolved. Okay, we talk about this, the way that the examination system is as well, or the way that we would have our analysis being done. So, so what the person talks about is, the fair selection is everybody has to take the same exam. So please climb a tree. Now, can a fish climb a tree? Can, which type of actually animals can climb and which cannot? So it cannot be standardized across the board. Hence, we would look in for the rigor as well as the quality perspective as part of the study. So with this, I would stop here and open up if there are any questions before we close the session. I know there are a lot of things that I wanted to pack it across within these 2 hours, both on qualitative as well as quantitative studies. But yeah, there are a lot of things that we could discuss more in. So let me open it up for questions. If you got any questions, please do unmute yourself and you can go ahead and ask your question. Okay. Anushka Sharma, what is your question? Can you please tell us how to analyze an open-ended data for mixed method as it would be in large amount as per sample? What do you mean by, okay, mixed method? I know I can understand what you talk about open-ended data. What do you mean by large amount as per the sample? Akanksha Sharma. Are you there in the call, Akanksha? Akanksha, please unmute yourself and can you clarify your point? Okay. Okay, Joseph, John, you got the question about the phenomenology in ethnography. Yeah, there are multiple approaches to qualitative methods, which within these 2 hours covering both qualitative and quantitative is very, very difficult for. Yeah. But these are very, very, quite important concepts when we come into the qualitative studies about to understand the phenomena, okay, using phenomenology. Ethnography is something that we be with the samples, for example, based upon the study that we do in order to emulate the environment, be with them for doing these analysis. There are many such examples I can quote in from these. Maybe in some other more in-depth, then we come into focus only on qualitative, maybe we can describe further onto this, but yeah, multiple things to be looked into. Akanksha, can you unmute yourself? You're saying your audio is not working. If a sample size is 400 and quant data is collected, open-ended questions. No. What do you mean by this? How will you analyze your open-ended questions in a quantitative? You want to know about quantitative or qualitative? That's itself you're talking about in one place is mixed method, in other places quantitative. What do you mean by this? Now you need to unmute yourself in order to explain your question itself, Akanksha. Simply having an open-ended question in a quantitative study doesn't become a mixed method. That's not the approach to be used in for. There are approaches you need to follow when you talk about qualitative study or a mixed method study. Simply one question open-ended doesn't make it as a mixed mode method, Akanksha. I would recommend please go through the books or the research papers which talks about mixed method approaches. Okay. One question doesn't qualify for it. Okay, any other questions before we wind up? Are the A category journals more on qualitative study? Okay, Alok, there are specific journals which would take into consideration qualitative studies. There are some specific journals which would take only quantitative studies, but there are many journals which would actually encourage both qualitative and quantitative studies. For example, I have got my publication in ABDC A journal, which is Marketing and Intelligence Planning, using the qualitative study. Okay, it is very much accepted in A category journals, and you will find there are many more papers of quantitative studies as well as part of the journal. So it is very well accepted norm as part of ABDC to have qualitative studies as well as quantitative studies. Okay. Any other questions? Okay, I guess no. Dr. Meena Kumari, if there are no questions, I will pass it on to you for a formal closure of the session.
Hello, I'm Vishnuba. I am in very initial phase of a research. I just started with a Kothari book. Sir, can you please list out some other books or any resources from where I can start further or in-depth research material, sir?
Okay, Vishnuba, there are many books on the research methodology. Okay, what you talk about Kothari is a very, very basic one. There are some good books that you can always refer to. One is Naresh Malhotra, and Naresh Malhotra actually talks. There is an Indian adaptation wherein Professor Dash has contributed to it. He's part of the IIM Lucknow. You can go into various details on both quantitative as well as some on the qualitative approach as part of this book. I would always recommend Naresh Malhotra's book. If you want to do only, so what you should also look for apart from these research methods, look for what are the techniques that you will be using. For example, if you use SPS as a mouse, you need to refer to some of those books on how would you do the analysis, how would you infer the results from this. There are specific books for that. Similarly, if you're using, say, Smart PLS as part of your quantitative study, you need to look for the books by Higher. And there are such books which you could use and for. What I have also done is, I'm not sure if you have access to my website. Okay. You could find, can you see my screen? I think I have, okay, I stopped sharing. Let me reshare my screen. This is my website. I will paste it as well on the chat.
Yes, sir. You had already given a link in a previous sessions.
Okay, perfect. If you go into my website, I have listed down some of these resources as well. For example, if you want to look in for some critical books and research papers, I have listed them here. And you could make use of these, the books, as well as, I've given in here for Bryman, Creswell, Malhotra, and Dash, Newman, Zickman. These are good books related to research methods. And similarly for qualitative, for SEM, if you are focusing on SEM, what should be that for PLSM? Similarly for AMOS, I've given a lot of these here. And also if you are looking in for some of the research papers related to each of these areas of study, I have listed them here. So you can always refer to these resources as part of my website. You should be able to get them.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
Okay. Any other questions? Let me paste it here. This will have all the resources as well. Okay, good. I hope there are no further questions.
In case if there are no further questions, I think we can wind up the session.
Yeah, I've taken additional 11 minutes beyond the schedule.
No, sure, sir. Thank you so much, sir. I know it's an extended sessions for you yesterday and today. Thanks a lot for helping us and helping students to understand better about quantitative and qualitative research today. Guys, thank you so much for you as well. Tomorrow, let's meet up exactly at 9 o'clock. Thank you, sir.
Thank you all for joining in, and namaskar to everyone. Bye.